Remote viewing, time travel, telekinesis, these are all abilities that were accessible to today's guest, Andrew Basiago, from a very young age. Because of his father's professional position, Andrew became the focus of attention, his abilities tapped for military use. What he has seen is far beyond the imagination of most of us, yet he sees the beauty in all of it. And I'm so happy to finally meet you. I first heard of your work about 7 years ago through a mutual contact. And here we are, finally. It takes a while to manifest sometimes, although theoretically, I guess you could have jumped right to it.
Awesome.
Or I could have jumped back.
It's great to be with you, Regina.
Yes. Let's just, with your story, because we have only an hour and this really could take hours to tell, let's start with you from a very young age and then move into the very early years, by the age of 6, of your participation in some of these now known experiments, though they were very deeply hidden until recently.
Well, as a young child, I certainly had a sense of having been reincarnated from previous lives. I certainly remembered a number of my past lives. I was demonstrating special abilities. For example, at our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, my father had witnessed me levitating some of my small toys in one incident before I entered kindergarten at age 4 at a local elementary school. I was often going down to our cellar at our house in Morris Plains, where my dad had a carpentry shop, and completing his thoughts. So I had, I would say, some expanded awareness, and I also was not aware of things that I couldn't do. In other words, I had the ability to achieve something, such as read somebody's thoughts or cause small objects to hover above the floor, simply because I had the intent and the understanding that I could do so. I wasn't putting limits on myself. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was selected for DARPA's Project Pegasus beginning in the fall of 1969, when I was entering the 3rd grade.
Let's talk about the training of you and the other very young people that were there. And let's start out with some of the really simple things, like the card games and such, to start identifying who's who.
Well, we know under Project Talent, beginning in the late 1950s, when Admiral Rickover essentially set as a national goal identifying young Americans of exceptional intellectual, psychic, and leadership ability, that there was really a national screening process going on. In fact, many of your viewers will remember that 5.5 days of testing, where we were even coming in on Saturday mornings to complete that national exam. Mm-hmm. That was the result of Project Talent trying to find young people that they could work with, for example, on secret defense and intelligence projects. I was one of them, identified, and so in the fall of 1969, a couple months after the lunar landing of July 1969, I was placed in a learning lab at my elementary school, which was Mount View Road School in Morris Plains, New Jersey. And we were immediately involved in a set of academic exercises in speed learning and different things that the intelligence community would identify as alpha intelligence training, the ability to acquire information very rapidly, to understand what we were perceiving, to memorize it, to report it back to other team members. And that was going on right from the very beginning with psychic training, where the children who were performing well in the psychic games we were playing were being retained in the program, and those who were not performing so well were being dismissed from the learning lab. So I remember the first game that we were playing was a game called Concentration, where the special educator in the learning lab would select 1 out of 52 standard playing cards and look at it and understand what card it was, and place it to her forehead and begin concentrating on what card it was. And she would go round robin for, let's say, 90 minutes or so with 4 or 5 of the children in the project. And I remember guessing the card correctly with 1 out of 52 odds for the whole session, maybe getting 1 guess wrong. Maybe I would guess 5 of hearts versus 5 of diamonds. Mm-hmm. So in addition to what I believe my father probably reported to the Department of Defense, that I was demonstrating special abilities like levitation and clairvoyance, I think I was identified as a pretty advanced psychic at that time, in the beginning of that 3rd grade school year. I like to say that the children that were ultimately selected for time travel under Project Pegasus were small mediums at large.
I know, that's cute.
And at that very
small
fall,
mediums at large, that's very cute.
Yeah.
But let's talk about your dad. Now, what was your dad? Which defense contracting firm was he working for?
my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, was a special projects engineer educated at Lehigh University with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering, who was then employed for the Ralph M. Parsons Company during those years of New York City, and then Parsons, of course, later moved to Pasadena, California. Parsons is, every year, arguably either the first or second largest process engineering company, often vying with Bechtel Corporation for that honor, and remains a leading defense contractor. It's just done some amazing things around the world. They built an entire city called Yanbu in Saudi Arabia. They were the defense contractor that implemented the MX missile system. And what the public has not been told is something that it was actually hinted at on the Ralph M. Parsons Company website until fairly recently, when I began talking about my experiences as the son of a Parsons engineer, which is that the Ralph M. Parsons Company gave the United States government time travel.
A few questions would arise here. One of them was the technology that they were using developed by them, or was it maybe reverse engineered from off-planet cultures, technologies?
It was all of the above. DARPA, working with Parsons and the CIA, created an intelligence funnel sometime, I believe, in the mid-1960s, because they had several leading forms of time travel, including teleportation and chronovision, fully operational by 1970. We also know from the encounter between my father and I at the Lincoln Speech Site in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on November 19th of 1863, that he had been time traveling for several years before I began to even be trained in the program. And so into that intelligence funnel, DARPA was placing all of the above, everything that would give the US government a time-space travel capability. Those would include information from ancient civilizations on Earth, the Babylonian, Egyptian, and Sumerian experiments with time travel, extraterrestrial sources from both downed UFO craft and as a result of ET human liaison, which was part of Project Pegasus, and then of course the information from foreign intelligence sources, which would include the Nazi German and Soviet Russian work in time travel, and of course the work of contemporary geniuses like Nikola Tesla, Fathers Ernetti and Gemelli, who were the Benedictine priests that accidentally discovered chronovision and then joined with Enrico Fermi in perfecting it. So it was really a kind of a catchpot into which they were throwing anything that would enable the US government to send people non-locally in time-space or to propagate holograms of past and future events.
Let's talk about the actual experience then. The first time you made a jump, so to speak, from one time frame to another, you were with your father, which I would think
Correct.
that there was some strategy in that. There's a certain comfort in that, and your
Right.
father had already been before you, right?
Right. They wanted to create a cadre of young Americans who would feel comfortable time traveling in adulthood, just like a child that you involve in scuba considers moving between the terrestrial and the aquatic environment. It's just part of everyday life. They wanted to enable us to be able to go from the present timeline that we're on to a past or future timeline effortlessly, without any anxiety, without any sense of something extraordinary going on. So I believe that that was one of the motives for my father beginning to involve me in teleportation at age 6. What happened is we left our home in Morris Plains, my dad shouting to my mom in the house that, "Hon, I'm taking Andy to the hardware store," which was not in Woodridge, New
That's
Jersey.
a code.
Yeah, which was in Florham Park, New Jersey. And instead we drove up to the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, which also was about 15 minutes from the house. And we were cleared through security there into Building 68. And in a small laboratory in Building 68, there was a device in the front of the room. It basically consisted of two parenthesis-shaped booms that were about 8 feet high, maybe about 10 feet apart from each other on the floor. And there was a technician sitting at a rudimentary computer keyboard and screen, controlling the device, setting the time-space coordinates. And then on the right side of the machine, there was a power cord that was plugged into the wall that really wasn't much larger than you would use to power a small industrial device, let's say an industrial lathe or drill press. And my dad explained that when the technician turned on the device, we would see a field of energy that when we then just took a run at that field of energy and jumped through that energy, we would find ourselves in a tunnel for several seconds. The tunnel would close, and then we would find ourselves elsewhere in the country, say in a hilly area somewhere else in the country. So what the energy that was being broadcast between the two armatures of the device, these two parentheses-shaped booms, was a form of energy that Nikola Tesla discovered that he called radiant energy, which is a form of energy that is latent and pervasive in the physical universe and has among its attributes the capacity to bend the fabric of time-space. And so when the technician turned on the device at my dad's request, what I saw between the two booms now was energy being broadcast between the two booms that looked sort of like water falling in a public water sculpture. And then when my dad had me approach the energy field, it looked like raster on a TV set, the black and white snow pattern on a TV set. And I could see that at 3-inch intervals there were little squiggles of greenish blue light that were moving back and forth across the field of raster, or radiant energy as it was, in opposite directions. So there was radiant energy, and there was something that was affecting that field of radiant energy. And we did a couple of rehearsals, and then my dad grabbed my hand, and on the count of 3, I essentially leapt into the U.S. time-space program, because when we did so, I found us moving and then seemingly not moving at all within the vortal tunnel that the radiant energy produced when it was punched into a tunnel as a result of the inertia of us physically jumping toward the field of energy. It looked kind of like the bluish-white tunnel that people describe in the near-death experience. But I noticed that when I turned my head rapidly to the left or right, I could see holograms of intervening events on other timelines flashing by.
Yes.
So it was sort of like being in an amusement park ride where you had the sensation of movement in a tunnel.
And you had no sensation of fear because this was something, your dad was there and it was just a game almost? Or
well, actually, he said I looked terrified. He later described it.
Really?
I looked terrified.
Do you remember feeling terrified?
Well, I was always kind of stiffening up like a young Harry Truman would in his photographs.
Yeah.
I was never really comfortable with the experience of going through the tunnel because the strange thing is that we were going very rapidly, but also seemingly not at all.
So let me ask you what it felt like on your physical body.
It felt like non-movement movement. It was paradoxical. I sensed that I didn't feel anything besides a slight sort of electromagnetic stimulation. And on the first jump, I could see my father's hair kind of floating around as a result of that electrostatic energy being in the tunnel, affecting something that could move, something that could be magnetized and then was free to move. We couldn't bring magnetic metals in because they would also discharge as a result of the electrostatic energy in the tunnel. But it was just rather strange. And sometimes when I would look down at the black, glassy, floor-like bottom that was almost like there was nothing beneath us. In fact, Dr. Robert Beckwith was calling this form of teleportation levitated teleportation, because you were essentially hovering in a time-space tunnel, moving elsewhere to another point on the face of our planet. But also, essentially what was going on is the rest of the universe was being wrapped around your ears. I mean, we were going, but as a result of the theory of relativity, the performance of that premise, that natural trait of the physical universe, we were really going nowhere and hovering there in the laboratory and being readjusted in time-space on the face of our planet as a result of the rest of the universe rushing past our heads. So it was kind of like, I've described how it was kind of like going through the Lincoln Tunnel without a car at 10,000 miles per hour.
Okay, that's a good description.
So
what happened? Where did you land on the other side?
Well, what would happen is we would see a small little pinprick of light in the distance, and that would suddenly get much larger, and that was the tunnel basically closing. So we were seeing a little bit of sunlight at the destination, which was always the state capitol grounds of New Mexico in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so the tunnel closed, and I found footfall in this sort of hilly city that my dad described, sort of the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds where you have kind of a hodgepodge of elevations, different eras of buildings and so forth. I later learned that they used Santa Fe and a public arrival like that because they didn't want to inform anybody at the Los Alamos National Labs, where there was a Soviet spy ring, that we had achieved physical teleportation. And also, they didn't want it to become a military secret by, for example, having us arrive on military bases. So they had literally selected a kind of a secluded area of the state capitol complex there in Santa Fe for us to just pop into view.
So you and your dad popped in, and I assume others, but for the sake of this conversation, you and your dad popped into view in a public place in front of a public building?
Yes, and in fact, I not only was, my arrivals just suddenly popping into view were sometimes not only witnessed, but when I went on my first of 3 major fact-finding trips to New Mexico to retrace my experiences in Project Pegasus, I asked a waitress at the Mineshaft Tavern restaurant in Madrid, New Mexico, and I said, "Did you ever hear any stories when you were growing up here of children suddenly popping into view up at the state capitol complex?" And she described how she had been born in Santa Fe and grown up in Madrid, but that when she entered kindergarten in Santa Fe at age 5 in 1974, which was literally 2 years after I left Project Pegasus, that she heard the stories of children suddenly appearing in the state capitol complex. And I was able to say, I was one of those kids. We were in a teleportation project under DARPA, and we were physically arriving, and there was nothing extraordinary. Well, there's something extraordinary about it, but it wasn't magic. It was high technology.
So you were actually jumping in location, but not in time. You were jumping into the same time frame?
Well, initially we were arriving in real time. So if we jumped through the Tesla device in Woodridge, New Jersey at 10 a.m. and got there in several seconds, it was 8 a.m. in Santa Fe, and you could see state office workers coming to work in the morning and so forth. However, after doing many jumps with my classmates who were in the project in the summer of 1970, by fall of 1970, we noticed that we would spend the whole day in New Mexico until night fell. But then when we would arrive back on the tarmac at Curtis Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, it would be, let's say, 10:30 in the morning. So that they were adjusting the device to bring us back in time, to basically time travel to the past when we arrived on the East Coast, arrived back at our point of embarkation via Tesla teleportation. So we asked some of the facilitators there at Curtis Wright, "Are you putting us back in time?" And they acknowledged that they were. And so we said there in fall of 70, "How far back in the past can you send us?" And they said, "At this point, we're only sending you back 12 hours. Because you have to jump back to the past and still arrive at a time after the development of teleportation. Because as we begin to do this regularly, we don't want to strand you in the past."
Right.
And that was a limitation of physical teleportation via that device. So another thing that was occurring to control for that displacement problem was they were developing chronovisors that would propagate holograms of past and future events, where when the hologram collapsed, we were back on the stage of the device in real time. And they were also developing other forms of physical time travel, which I was involved in, including a technology called plasma confinement, where you were embedded in usually a past event rather than a future one. And with the future, of course, you can jump back through a Stargate, through a teleporter, and come home, because time travel technology defines the technical infrastructure of the future.
Yes.
But in the case of all the time travel to the past that we were doing, they were actively developing technologies where you were essentially embedded in a past event, and when that localized quantum field effect where it wore off, you then spontaneously found yourself back in the laboratory in real time.
You went both directions.
Correct.
Okay, let's first talk about, before we go into the Plasma Confinement Center and all that brings to the story, jump forward, what you would have been used for example, in a jump forward in time.
Well, in a jump forward in time, when I was taking the Stargate from Cerrillos, New Mexico in 1972 to a Project Pegasus intelligence base in the year 2045, I was being used as an errand. And people always ask me, well, what was 2045 like? And I say, well, it was about taking a Stargate to the plaza of an industrial park, walking into a beautiful emerald green and tungsten steel building that was all white inside with all these houseplants, meeting with several people from the project who were the age that my great-grandchildren will be, or you know, essentially the next couple generations forward in time, meeting with them, being given a little canister with microfilm in it that contained historical summaries of events that will take place on our timeline between the 1970s and the 2040s, being directed to a teleportation unit that was recessed invisibly into the wall of a conference room, and again taking a vortal tunnel back to my point of embarkation in the past in 1972. In fact, we were arriving in the vicinity of the microwave tower array near the Continental Divide, north of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, the so-called Lobo Overlook site, where there's an array of microwave towers that are now called basically Montauk Southwest by individuals like myself in the time travel community, because now it's 100 antennae, not 5. But what we were told those microwave towers were doing was pinging microwave into the cosmos so that the project personnel in the future could identify where the past was that we needed to be teleported
Oh, interesting,
back to.
like a marker. Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, were you privy to the information that was transferred via the microfilm or whatnot of events to transpire between that time and 2045?
Right. No, in fact, Project Pegasus was primarily an intelligence gathering project to enable, as a result of the U.S. government acquiring better information about past events and future events, they hope to be able to perform better contingency planning for present and future events. And so, because it was an intelligence project under CIA, ultimately, certain intelligence reports were being promulgated about what the U.S. Chrononaut Corps was reporting about the past and future event scenarios that they were sent to. I didn't have a need to know what was on that microfilm.
Right.
We were shown during our training that those tiny little chapstick-sized canisters had about 600 feet of microwave in them.
Huh.
And that training, that trainer basically took that 1,600 feet out and dropped it at his feet and showed us how much information we were taking back to the present. But
what were you able to glean just from your surroundings and
Well,
what you were able to observe of that time?
Well, because I was my father's son, and he was essentially quantum displaced for 8 years in New Mexico, so that when he died chronologically at age 66 in 1990, he was actually 74 biologically, where they were jumping him to New Mexico. He was living there for days, weeks, months, and even years, and then being jumped back to the
Did he
real time.
disappear from your life for those
No,
periods of time?
because they were just like...
It was time collapse. I mean,
They were collapsing
Yeah.
the time loops by
Yeah.
having us stay in New Mexico,
Yeah.
and then they would jump us back not just to New Jersey, but New Jersey on the day we had originally jumped.
Okay.
So that we were all basically participating in these secret time loops that were actually being collapsed.
So let's talk about 2045 for a second before we
Right.
move on. Can you tell us
Well,
about what you...
2045, I mean, there is a 2045.
Yeah.
The world is not destroyed by then. And in that location of the American Southwest, the people looked healthy. The young people looked taller and thinner. I think we're actually seeing that in society.
Mm-hmm.
Some of today's young people look a lot more spindly
Mm-hmm.
physiologically than previous generations. There's a different look. I call it the avatar effect of better prenatal and neonatal care, better nutrition, the elimination of toxic substances from our environment, the use of positive energies to promote wellness in the next generation. Our grandchildren's generation is going to be healthier. The environment looked a little wetter in the American Southwest. We were never told where they were sending us. But if we were to presuppose it was some relatively uninhabited area outside of a city in the Southwest, a Santa Fe, a Tucson, a Flagstaff, it seemed a little bit more temperate than I had encountered the American Southwest.
Interesting, because it's certainly
since.
been wetter in the last couple of years, interestingly.
You know, it seemed a little bit closer to the New Jersey I had grown up in, a little bit more temperate and a little bit more rain. As a result of bringing that information back, I know that Project Pegasus was furnishing the U.S. Department of Defense with a history of the future, but I only learned about what some of those events were that they knew of as a result of the time-space program, as a result of being my father's son and spending so much time with him in New Mexico before jumping back, and also going so far down the rabbit hole that there would even be a reason for me to be quantum displaced in New Mexico and in my dad's company, where I frequently went to lunch and dinner with his colleagues, typically at the La Hacienda or La Placida restaurants, which were then, and to some extent still are, the most favorite Mexican restaurants in all of New Mexico. So if there were distinguished officials there from Washington, frequently we would have these group dinners at those restaurants in Old Town Albuquerque. And what I learned is that they were aware of specific events and conditions. They included, let's see from memory here that I can recall, they knew about the resignation of President Nixon in a scandal called Watergate.
And this was a few years prior to the event.
Yes, they knew about the emergence of the internet. In fact, I listened to John McCone, a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, at one of those restaurants, describe to my father what the internet was. I remember how he said, well, Ray, the internet is the fulfillment of Vannevar Bush's primary fundamental. It's a global information network. And the individual communicating with on that network with people throughout the world that they want to communicate with sits at a keyboard like the rudimentary ones that have already emerged in our electronic typewriters. And they look at a simple video display terminal, and by doing so, they can communicate with anybody in the world who's on the system at that time. And then they started talking about the stems, the suffixes in the destinations, .com, .net, .info, .edu, and so forth. And my dad asked John McCone, who literally had been the director of Central Intelligence for 4 years of the early 60s, 4 very eventful years from 1960 to 64, right before essentially being one of sort of the pipe smokers, one of the scholars in the intelligence community who were both promulgating and reading the intelligence reports about the past and future that resulted from the debriefings of individuals like me who they were sending to the past and future. And my dad said, well, what about this .com suffix? And John McCone, John Alexander McCone, everybody was calling him Alec or Alex, all of the project people I remembered. And he was actually smoking a pipe. And he said to my dad, well, Ray, that's just a destination on the system. It just means communications. And my dad got up from the table and said, well, how do we know that? Maybe it means the commies have taken over by then.
Yeah.
So I think that anecdote kind of gives an insight into the fact that as a result of starting to send children and adults to past and future events and promulgating these one-off holograms of past and future events, the project principals were by no means omniscient about, for example, what the future held.
Sure.
But in addition to the Nixon resignation and the internet, 9/11 was openly discussed in front of me at different meals that we took with the project people.
And this was in the 60s?
This would be early 70s.
Early 70s.
In fact, my dad and my father was called down to the Aerojet Corporation facility that then existed immediately adjacent to the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology in Socorro, New Mexico, and we viewed about a 20-second film loop that had been retrieved from the future, I don't know by what means, of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers on 9/11. And then there were times when we would be at a meal, particularly lunchtime, and some of the individuals who were being let into fewer of the secrets about the future that the project was collecting would sort of inveight upon my dad to reveal what he knew as one of the senior project people. And so the 9/11 event was discussed openly in my presence in the early 70s when I was a child on Project Pegasus.
If you liked this video and you want to see more amazing content, go ahead and check out the next video on our channel.